Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's my pleasure on this rather stormy evening to extend a very warm welcome to you all, to family, to friends, to colleagues, to students, to our wider community, to the inaugural lecture of Professor of Law at the Faculty of Law, Fiona McDonald. I'm Robin Longhurst, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, and let me now introduce you to Fiona McDonald's work and research before inviting her to give her inaugural lecture. Fiona studied law and politics at Victoria University of Wellington before studying in Halifax, Canada, receiving her doctorate of the Science of the Law from Dalhousie University, where she's also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Bioethics. She joined Victoria University of Wellington in 2025 as professor specialising in public and government law relating to health systems, with scholarly interests across a wide range of topics. Fiona has recently been appointed Associate Dean Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Law. She's a multidisciplinary researcher who undertakes research in the nexus between law, policy and ethics in the health context. Fiona says she landed in law by accident. Initially aiming for a career as a government policy analyst, she saw law as a way to broaden her skills. Her primary interests lie in how regulation is used in law, policy and ethics to create and maintain health systems and services that are equitable and accountable. Her research has four broad themes. So, the governance of health systems, including public and environmental health, the governance of health organisations, the governance of health professionals and health workforce, and the governance of health technologies. Fiona's published extensively. She's the co-editor of Health Law in Australia, which is the leading health law textbook in Australia, and now in its fourth edition. She was awarded a prestigious Durham International Senior Research Fellowship from Durham University in 2019. And Fiona's received funding from numerous international granting agencies and has active research collaborations in Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Nepal, the United Kingdom and Vietnam. Her current project looks at how and whether to use a protective mechanism to offer partial protection to children from the harmful effects of urban air pollution in 2 Southeast Asian countries. So this research is funded by the UK Research and Innovation, which is a public body sponsored by the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Fiona's worked in academic roles in the School of Law at Queensland University of Technology until 2025. She served as the co-director of the Australian Centre for Health Law Research from 2018 to 2022. She's an adjunct professor at the Australian Centre for Health Law Research at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and was a member of the Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dalhousie University in Canada. So, in this lecture on health injustice, examining structural dysfunction in the health system law, Fiona will examine the ways our use of rules, so legal, ethical, policies and standards, raises complex and deeply important questions about how our systems enable health, justice or injustice. Fiona's research journey started when she sat in a specialist's office as a 19-year-old student at Te Herenga Waka and heard words no one wants to hear. As she sat there with the noises of the world drowned out by those words, echoing over and over in her head, she thought about power, privilege, and their impact on people's access to an experience of the health system. So, reflecting on vignettes of her patient experience, she'll discuss the implications of these moments for health systems, law, policy and ethics. So, if our health system is an expression of our values, what are they? And how can we and how should we use the law to better express and enable those values? So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Fiona McDonald and invite her to the podium.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mai haere mai, ko Fiona, tōku ingoa, ko McDonald, taku whānau, ko Olympus, taku waka, ko Tauranga Moana, te whenua tapu, ko Ngāti Pākehā, taku iwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I warmly welcome my family and my friends who sit in the audience today. I welcome those who will watch a recording later. And I also acknowledge those who've sadly passed and are no longer here to listen. I acknowledge my friends, colleagues, and students who are based overseas who will listen to a recording. And I welcome all of my colleagues and students from Te Herenga Waka. You've been so warm and welcoming to me as a new arrival to the university, and I cannot tell you just how much I appreciate it. This is a return home to Aotearoa and to Te Herenga Waka after a very, very, very long time away. I want to particularly acknowledge two people in the audience, Justice David Collins, who was my mentor into health law from when I was a student and has been a friend and a mentor and a colleague ever since. So thank you, Justice Collins. I also want to acknowledge Professor Jonathan Boston, who introduced me to health policy back when I was a student. And so thank you for being here today as well. To those in the audience I don't yet know, welcome. And I thank you for your interest and how my personal experiences as a patient have shaped my research over the years. As a 19-year-old student at Te Herenga Waka, I developed a range of really alarming symptoms, really disabling. Māori Ora, as it is now, acted swiftly and organised a referral to a specialist. The Thursday before the Easter break, I sat in the neurologist's office and heard words no one wants to hear. A brain tumour. Multiple sclerosis. I sat there with the noises of the world drowned out by those words echoing over and over in my head. The world fragmented and then reformed. A scan to confirm or exclude the diagnosis was organised immediately after Easter. And spoiler alert, I had neither. Very relieved. But it was the start of a 7-year journey of really disabling illness. And so I want to reflect on that today. As soon as the consultation was over, I went immediately to the public library to do some research on what these words may have meant and may mean for me. As I read, the scream in my head of, "Why me?" transmuted into, "Why me?" I read accounts of how long the process could be at that time in New Zealand to get an appointment, to get diagnostic testing, to get a diagnosis. I sat in that neurologist's office and had a scan so swiftly because my parents had private health insurance and they had maintained my coverage after I became an adult. I had the socioeconomic privilege that I could move around the queue for publicly funded services. But was that fair? In my studies, we'd been discussing the Woodhouse report. Thank you, Jeff. I think it was Jeff. That was the impetus for the development of accident compensation, New Zealand's no-fault insurance scheme, that replaced suing for compensatory damages for personal injuries in New Zealand in the 1970s. Part of the rationale for the sweeping recommendations in that report was concerns for equality and a perception that the community should be responsible for the protection of all its members who face personal injury due to an accident. Shouldn't timely access to healthcare be determined by need and not economic privilege? If health is considered a public good, which is a public good is something that benefits the population as a whole, such that government should fund or provide it universally, and is considered a human right, why should one sector of society have privileged access to health services over another? This raised questions of justice to me. Yet, in my naivete, and because of the situation I was in, otherwise known as self-interest, I was soothed by the logic of capitalism. If economically privileged people were able to access the private system, this would take some of the burden from the public system and enable less economically advantaged people to access services sooner. So I was actually doing a good thing. Later research I undertook with a health economist colleague when I lived in Australia confirmed that this is a furphy. But it does make us think about, do we need a system? Should we have a system with both public and private components? Not every nation does this. Some nations have an exclusively public service provision of medically necessary services. Is that more equitable? Is that better? These are some of the questions I think about during my research. The other thing that struck me as I sat in the room, and the many, many other subsequent rooms in my 7-year journey through the health system, and other, fortunately, less extensive journeys I've undertaken in other subsequently, was its architecture. Now, not in terms of actual architecture, but the architecture of power. We discussed in class how the structure of courtrooms was intentionally designed to reinforce the power of the state, the sense that the individual needed to cower before its majesty, or at least be properly deferential to it. The way the judge was elevated above everyone on a dais, the iconography of the state adorning its walls, the room designed so that individuals were supplicants, the use of rituals to reinforce power, standing when the judge enters and leaves, the defendant or applicant remaining silent unless asked by the judge or the lawyers to speak, the rote words spoken by the judges and the parties, the use of artefacts like at one time robes and wigs and gavels. All of these factors were purposely designed to reinforce power dynamics. In the spaces in the health system I frequented, the architecture of power was more subtle, more muted, towards a different end, but as real. The rooms with certificates placed proudly on the wall, the reference books, the informational models or posters, the desk behind which the health professional sits in specialist offices, often separating themselves from the patient, the apparatus of expertise, the stethoscope, the blood pressure cuff, and so on. The long, confusing, winding corridors and the inherent stress of navigating your way through unfamiliar surroundings. The waiting room where you approach reception as a supplicant and fidget as you wait for your name to be called before you are ushered into the presence. The visually depressing environments in most adult-focused health spaces. There's sometimes evident hierarchies between doctors and nurses and other health professionals and within professional groups. And the language and concepts that can be highly technical if the professional forgets or chooses not to translate. And of course, even if they do, the concepts require a degree of health literacy to navigate. Large numbers of people who are not immersed in those worlds, and even some that are not health literate. And some are just too sick or too shocked to comprehend. All of these environmental factors are about supporting a profession's claim to power based on expertise. But who determines who is expert or has expertise? How and why do we reinforce this through the use of regulation? To what end? What is determined to be the legitimate basis for expertise? And how can people or professions or organisations challenge or contest it? When the system was first designed, doctors and other health professionals often had paternalistic relationships with patients. However, increasingly the rhetoric is that we are, or at least we should be, moving to a partnership model between patient and health professionals and communities and hospitals. Partnership is really considered important as it aims to shift power to move to a more equal footing and to enable patient autonomy, a rationale that supports justice. It's also argued to be structurally important from a population health perspective, as true partnerships can be really empowering for groups who have traditionally been stereotyped, discriminated against, and/or abused. But what does this purported shift to partnership mean for claims to power based on expertise, and what and whose expertise should now be legitimated and in what form? And yes, I am very much aware of the irony of pointing architecture out when this very room and my person are examples of the use of architecture to reinforce standing. And my colleagues have been teasing me for some time that I need to do an interpretive dance, so here you go. Sometime later in this patient journey, I sat in yet another specialist's office. The tone was patronising. I left the consultation feeling that I had been told that my illness was my fault and my responsibility. That I had, as it was implied many women do, thought myself into being ill. That I was magnifying what I was experiencing for attention. That I should get over myself and it. I'm sure many women in the audience relate to this type of experience, where gender stereotyping, such as the old medical theory that a woman are prone to hysteria, is used as a way to diminish a woman's concerns about her health and as a way for health professionals to deal with the uncertainty they are experiencing when they can't work out what a diagnosis is. The term we use today is gaslighting. It made me second guess for many years, and in fact I still second guess myself and whether I'm imagining something is wrong with my health today. It was that profound an impact that it lingers. This obviously has been reinforced by other interactions, sadly, that I have had with health systems in 3 different countries. I experienced this because of gender, but every day Māori and Pacifica peoples, homeless people, people experiencing disability, people who live in rural areas, and many other groups experience gaslighting, or its close cousin, discrimination, or at its worst, out-and-out racism, misogyny, and abuse. It's not a revelation that this conduct is destructive of trust and explains why some people are reluctant to access the health system or refuse to do so. It also might, at least somewhat, explain the ways that people are pushing back against the medical system and medical expertise and scientific knowledge and understanding. So, for example, things like the increasing move to free birthing and the increasing sentiment around anti-vaccination. At the time I was sitting in that particular office being patronised and gaslit, we had anti-discrimination legislation. We had patient rights. So was more regulation needed to change the existing system to deal with this? Or did we need to fundamentally reform the way in which health services are delivered to address structural discrimination and misuse of power to ensure justice? Another thing that occurred to me during journeys through the New Zealand, Canadian and Australian health systems was the impact of public management. Thank you, Jonathan. When the focus turns to efficiency, transparency, productivity and fiscal accountability, it can create perverse incentives to focus on those factors rather than the safety and quality of care and or cultivating relationships of care with patients. What I experienced in these systems, I felt, was generally transactional. In the moments of intense vulnerability that come with great uncertainty, pain, and fear, patients deserve more. I deserved more. We, patients, are not line items on a budget. We are real people with real hopes and dreams, lives that are complex and multifaceted and relational. We are embedded in our whānau, our friendships, and our social networks. We are not impediments to the function of the system, but should be its focus. The system and the people who work within it should be set up in a way that acknowledges the complex lives we live, the choices we make, or the choices we are unable to make because that power or that choice has been taken from us or was not afforded to us in the first place. I recall sitting on a bed in A&E in Australia. I'd gone in with breathing issues, and I heard myself discussed by the health professionals, the doctors and the nurses, as being a problem for their statistics. In Australia, there were at that time targets for how long patients should be in A&E, and I was, quote, taking too long. We need to do something about her. I don't know whether they thought I was struggling too much to hear this or whether they just didn't care. But it was an incredibly hard thing to hear, that their care, their attention was not for me and what I was suffering. The patient who is struggling to breathe despite all the interventions they had used, but that their overwhelming concern was meeting the targets that they would be audited against. They then moved me into what was formerly a storeroom with some other patients because that space didn't count as A&E and therefore it didn't affect their statistics. Can't make this stuff up. The feeling of being an inconvenience to a system is very real. And it's also something that creates hesitation about returning to that system. When I have an asthma attack, after my experience in Australia, I'll never go to a hospital again. Never. Because I shouldn't feel like I'm an inconvenience to them. I'm a burden to them. I'm something that they would rather didn't happen. And that's a shame. That is an incredibly problematic thing for the system as a whole, that people spit out of that with these types of feelings. The focus on public management also raises questions about what we value the most. Do we value economic management or health as a public good? They don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they often appear to be. A decision to close down services in a rural community may be justified on the grounds of economic efficiency and or safety and quality, although there's limited and poor quality evidence about the latter. But this ignores the will and choices of those who live in those communities. It may raise greater barriers to their ability to access the right services in the right place, at the right time, in the right manner, which is very important, and that has associated implications for health justice. By the way, the Australian hospital I just discussed was the same hospital that on a previous visit to A&E with breathing problems had asked me if I had private health insurance, explaining that if I had private health insurance, they would admit me, and if I didn't, because they had ambulances ramped up, they would send me home in the same condition I went in. Which underlines my issue with going to a hospital when I have an asthma attack, I'm sure. But it also brings us in a full circle to that question of privilege, or lack thereof, and how it influences your journey through the system when we have both public and private systems, and whether this is consistent with our views about justice and accessing a public good. Many years later, it struck me that no one I dealt with during my illness as a student had asked about any causal factors that may have influenced my illness. When I got ill, I was living in Adams Terrace in Aro Valley. Yep. Those of you in this room who live in Wellington know exactly what this means. No sun, damp, dreary, and built into a hillside. A house built many years ago with no insulation, warped windows letting the gale force wind in, and condensation problems. We couldn't afford to heat it, aside from short bursts in here and there, but there was a real cost to not doing this. Allah. I could almost swear that lying in bed at night, I would shift in my always damp sheets and mildewed mattress protector and look up from my book and see the black mould spreading across the ceiling and the walls to further colonise the space. Damp red did not put a dent in it. The Healthy Homes Initiative was built on the insight that living in a home that isn't healthy causes or exacerbates disease. Many of the adverse determinants of health, poor housing, low income, food insecurity, etc., are disproportionately felt by those who experience socioeconomic disadvantage, a status which is again highly correlated with Indigenous peoples and other groups that are considered minorities. And this again brings us back to power and privilege. The determinants of health are critical when we think about justice in the health context. We need to be concerned as much about health outcomes as we are about access to health services. And we need to recognise their interconnectedness. But it seems like the focus of attention in health is often on reacting to problems and not on preventing them, or at least slowing them down or changing their trajectory or whatever. Why should we allow things to develop that then require health system intervention, whether from primary, secondary or tertiary care services, when we could stop it before it started? Possibly because these issues, poor housing, etc., are often in a separate governance silo from health. They're in the housing portfolio, they're in the environment and technology portfolio or whatever. And they're also often more vulnerable to the pressures of capitalism and ideology. One reason why Healthy Homes initiatives are so recent in Australasia is resistance and lobbying by those who owned rental properties and those who are concerned about property values. So power, privilege, and public management and mould are the prominent themes that I've explored in my research, and they all emerged from my patient experience. So my research focuses on the regulation of health and health systems. I think about the regulation of health in a broad way. It's not just about what government does in terms of the law it makes, because government is not the only actor in the health system. It includes the other regulatory tools that government and other actors like regulators and professions use to govern the system, its workforce, and the equipment the system uses, drugs, devices, etc., as well as what it does to promote population health or what it doesn't do. These tools include law, policy, standards, guidelines, codes of ethics, and so on. In other words, I'm interested in the constitutive functions of law, or as prominent 20th century legal scholar Carl Llewellyn termed it, the net organisation of the group or society as a whole, so as to provide cohesion, direction, and incentive. But I'm also interested in the impact of regulation on individuals and communities and their relationships with each other and with the world around them. So the impact of regulation on society. I'm a multidisciplinary researcher. I work across disciplines undertaking legal, policy, and ethical analyses. But I've also been really incredibly privileged to work with many other scholars and practitioners from other disciplines and or professions. The way that injustice sort of presents itself when we design the structures that we use to enable health and provide health services needs attention from researchers and practitioners with varying disciplinary perspectives and different ways of gathering data and organising it. My collaborators have ranged from anthropology, pictured as Christina Holmes from St. Francis Xavier University in Canada. This picture of us was taken on the day I received my job offer from Victoria University. Note the happy smiles. We were in Geneva for a workshop on reimagining public health. Christina is one of a number of anthropologists I have worked with. So I started with A and I end with V. This is Claire Horwell, who is a volcanologist, and that means the studies of volcanoes as opposed to Vulcans from Star Trek, just in case you were wondering. I mentioned to a colleague, I was, not from here, from a long time ago, that I was working with a volcanologist, and she seriously said, "Oh, what's Star Trek got to do with law?" Okay. Anyhow, we were in Nepal at a workshop in Kathmandu, and this was in respect of our Protecting Children from Exposures to High Levels of Air Pollution research project. That has been an amazing international, multidisciplinary, multi-country collaboration, and I'm so privileged to be a part of it. I've also researched the law, policy, ethics and practices of the health systems of a number of countries: Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, England, Indonesia, Nepal and Vietnam. There are more similarities than differences when thinking about health outcomes, health systems and services, and justice. The problems and challenges for health justice are truly global and universal, as well as local. I've been privileged to research the questions that arose from my patient experience in collaboration with many wonderful collaborators and friends. I continue to do so with my existing networks, and I look forward to exploring these issues with new friends and colleagues. As academic researchers, we build on the work and thinking of others, but we also research what is, while imagining what could or should be. In the rest of this presentation, I'm going to reflect on the limitations of what is from a health justice perspective. And to do that, I think it'd be helpful to go back so that we can go forward. Before I do this, I want to be clear, I'm drawing on my thinking about health systems generally, not just the system in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but in all the countries I've undertaken research. While they're disparate in economic capacity, language, culture, and many, many other factors, they were all, except England, unless you count 1066, colonised by European powers. The impact of international human rights instruments in the World Bank and other international, and some argue neo-colonial actors, has also influenced and, in a sense, homogenised health systems and their regulation globally. So health systems have been regulated for many thousands of years. The oldest surviving written legal code dates from 1795 to 1750 BCE. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi stated if a physician makes a large incision with the operating knife and kill him, or open a tumour with the operating knife and cut out the eye, his hands shall be cut off. Excellent. I'm so pleased that we have moved on. But I bring this up, not because I take joy in the prospect of doctors having their hands cut off, but because this regulates an individual patient-health professional relationship. It reflects the lack of complexity at that time and in that place about the way health services were provided. So, the starting point for health system law regulation as we understand it today is generally agreed to date from about 200 or so years ago. English public health law was formulated in the 19th century when intensive industrialisation and urbanisation necessitated a focus on population level interventions. These were the days where you had a city with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people with raw sewage running everywhere and horses dropping things everywhere and the fumes and the miasma from the factories and so on. You had toxic fog created from industrial emissions and so on. So their interventions at this time largely focused on minimising the spread of infectious diseases, including through sanitation measures, i.e. plumbing, love it, and vaccination, and on managing the immediate health impacts of occupational and industrial activity. The work I've undertaken with Sam Roach from Queensland University of Technology, we argue that the shape of public health and public health law, as we conceptualise it today, has its roots in its period referred to in the Enlightenment in European history. Enlightenment thinking influenced the structure of modern public health law as developed in England and other European nations and was so transferred to their colonies. Enlightenment thinking was a movement away from the dogmas of religion as a basis of thinking to rationality. And so what they meant by that really was, instead of having faith and being guided by faith as to what is, you would now be guided by the processes of scientific inquiry. So it was a move away towards a science and a scientific explanation of what was. So that was seen as a process for formulating new knowledge and values and using these to drive human progress. Disease was considered to impede human progress and, let's not forget the really important thing, economic development, and therefore needed to be managed scientifically, but only insofar as disease impacted human flourishing. We couldn't care less if animals were becoming endangered and dying and becoming extinct. It was just about human flourishing. So the greatest good of the greatest number of people, which is a very utilitarian approach, was part of this calculation. In many accounts, the gains made through public health interventions such as sanitation, vaccination, industrial hygiene, clean water, etc., was framed as an achievement of the rationality associated with the Enlightenment. But it's important to note here too that progress was defined in Eurocentric terms. Rationalism was deeply entwined with capitalism. In the health context, while the free market was seen as important, it was also recognised for capitalism to work. The state had a role to correct for market failure when markets created conditions when many people did not flourish. This was complemented by a concern emerging from philanthropy about the welfare of the poor and the need for charity. And this is charity as in the rich being benevolent towards the, quote, deserving poor. So the whole trope about dole bludgers and so on is not new. It's been with us for a long time. These factors led to a recognition of the need to control certain structural factors that impacted human mortality and morbidity at the population level. Further, the Enlightenment developed a conceptual distinction between humans and nature. This was a departure from past beliefs in the European sense, derived from thinking from ancient Greece, mainly Aristotle, that there was an integral connection between people and nature. In contrast, the Enlightenment viewed nature as both an object of study and an object of control. So, for example, Descartes wrote of making men masters and possessors of nature, and conceptualized human beings as outside of and separate from nature. Despite the Enlightenment being an intellectual movement separate from religion, the view of the dominion of man over nature was also consistent, at least in part, with some versions of religious thought. In this religious view, animals and land, or nature, are accordingly subject to human, quote, dominion, unquote, for exploitation and development. Very conveniently capitalist, don't you think? Capitalism also supported this approach to nature, enabling exploitation of nature to maximise human interests, and especially those of the, quote, civilised peoples, unquote, i.e. the Europeans. The legal norms emerging from the Enlightenment were therefore inherently anthropomorphic. Sorry, I always get stuck on that word. Albeit, as many critics justly conclude, in a way that was structured to ignore the interests of those humans and those civilisations who were not considered by the colonising powers to meet Eurocentric norms. It also didn't include anyone who was a female and anyone else who was othered for whatever reason. For example, they weren't Christian. The concerns of public health and health more generally may and are increasingly related and arise from the interactions between people, animals, and place. And that is the current crisis in public health that we are facing, that interconnectedness. So this separation and this ignorance of the interconnectedness between them does us all no favours as we think about the management of health. So this line of thinking separates these concerns into different silos. You have the environment, you have agriculture, you have health. They're not the same, but they are the same. The differentiation affects the scope of lawmaking and regulation more generally, even today. Part of Enlightenment thinking was an emphasis on the development of civilization measured against superior European norms. Colonisation, with its framing of Indigenous peoples as in need of civilising, was an integral part of this. Colonisation was framed as an act of beneficence by the civilised to the other, who were objectified as inferior. In nations that were colonised, the uncivilised were subjected through the use of law to a process of forced assimilation, which is not a story that anyone in this room would be ignorant about, and included the suppression of traditional health practices that were considered to be uncivilised. And an example from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the Tauhanga Suppression Act. Whether a group was civilised or not also drew on the popular understanding of Darwinism and survival of the fittest. Thus, there was thought to be a biological-based hierarchy between civilised peoples and others that was race-based, and indeed between men and women being the weaker sex, who were prone to hysteria and making stuff up about being ill. Biological determinism on the basis of race led to a very strong eugenics movement in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Eugenics-informed thinking also affected the direction of public health and the way in which services were or were not provided to groups of the population. Biological determinism about women was also influenced the design and delivery of health services. Interestingly, at least I think it's interesting, although women were the weaker sex biologically, they were routinely excluded from medical research until relatively recently for a plethora of reasons, including to protect women from the arduous consequences of medical research, and that women's hormones made it all too difficult. Results from studies involving only men were assumed to represent the population as a whole, even though they had been banging on about biological determinism between the sexes for a long time. I digress. Enlightenment thinking was embedded in what Mercier has described as the deep institutions of colonisation, and by that they mean the European legal and governance systems and frameworks. The next major step by governments in the regulation of health systems came with the introduction of universal public health care. This focused on creating a system where all, or almost all, had access to at least some important health services provided and or funded by the state. For some of the countries I have studied, this occurred early in the 20th century and others somewhat later. The justification for universal public health systems and the way in which law was used to constitute the system was deeply entwined, in my opinion, with Enlightenment thinking. And of course, this varied depending on the nation. For example, the need to ensure a healthy population to maximise the opportunities for economic development and to ensure states maintained healthy populations to support power disputes, otherwise known as war and aggression. It was also underpinned by the framing of the state as being paternalistic and beneficent towards the population by creating a system to provide them access to health services. It was founded on a concern for formal equality. Everyone has equal access, at least notionally. But formal equality continues to privilege those who already have power, as equality is not equity. Just because the system is universal doesn't mean that people can and will be able to access it, as barriers to their ability to actually do this remain. It was also a system that, in concert with prevailing medical practices at the time, justified and reinforced the undermining of autonomy of persons and peoples who were othered because of race, disability, gender, and etc. It also continued to exclude other non-rational understandings, knowledges, or ways of doing, especially those that emerged from non-European traditions about health and what it means and how it can be assured. It reinforced hierarchies of expertise, doctors and scientific knowledge, and continued to legitimate professions that in and of themselves were hierarchical and often paternalist. It continued the focus on human health, but also continued the separation of the preventative focus of public health and the delivery of health services, a separation that continues from a legislative point of view today. While a concern about moving from formal equality towards greater equity of access and outcomes was gestured towards in the years following, the next, in my opinion, major shift in health systems law was the introduction of the new public management in the late 20th century. The thinking about healthcare was now through an economic management lens. Patients became self-interested consumers, and private management norms were said to promote needed efficiencies within the system. Private, or at least contestable, delivery was better for the economic bottom line. Institutions needed to budget hold, find savings, and break even. Funding models in healthcare had often promoted a sense that health services were transactions, but this was exacerbated by the expectations from the new public management. Many aspects of the health system became increasingly impersonal and pro forma. To mangle Immanuel Kant, people felt that they were being treated as a means to an end rather than being an end in and of themselves. While health was still considered in most circles in these countries a public good, This was to a greater or lesser extent overshadowed by concerns about sound economic management by governments and their promotion of economic growth. The business of healthcare, rather than aroha and whanangatanga. It's also important to note the significant impact of the new public management and neoliberalism on other aspects of governmental operations that impact on health. Hence, we see rising inequity at the population level in Aotearoa, in Australia, in Canada, in England, in a multitude of other countries. This is in relation to income, housing, access to food, education, and health outcomes, amongst other indicators. Some countries have seen a leap backward in life expectancy. The past 20 or 30 years has also seen an increasing scepticism about healthcare as people push back against a perceived level of care because of competing or conflicting interests, commercialisation and corporatisation, ongoing inequities, time and personal pressures on the professionals who work in the system, and the flow-on impact on and for patients. Also of concern is the lack of holistic focus, the need for care and concern about the patient's ways of living and values, their joys, their fears, and their important relationships with people, animals, and place. So bringing these epochs of time together, we can continue to tinker with the system to promote justice as equity rather than equality, but these measures are often ad hoc and they're often undermined by economic rationalism and or ideology. Or we can reimagine what a just system could look like. A system that is both relational and integrated. Some might say this would cost too much, but the costs of continuing with a broken system may be much higher. Turning to Aotearoa, New Zealand, while some might see the door closing in New Zealand on a fundamental revision of law and policy after the current government's decision to end the Māori Health Authority, which was the first step in reimagining healthcare in New Zealand, and they ended that as quickly as it began, I continue to hope for the future and continue to advocate for a fundamental reimagining and redesign of health systems, law and policy, and the legal and policy structures traditionally siloed away from health, despite their real, often negative impact on health outcomes. If, as I believe it is, health and equitable access to health services are human rights, then this analysis indicates the ways in which the current manner in which we use and employ law and policy across the board are failing us in seeking to realise this vision. We need to move away from being confined by concepts from the past that still define our norms, and we need to move into a future underpinned with values that reflect who we are and who we want to be. A more just system. For me, my patient experience has confirmed that this is a pressing need, and that these concerns have informed and continue to inform my research journey every step of the way. Ngā mihi and haere rā. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff McClay. I'm the Dean, and at these functions it's my privilege to speak on behalf of my colleagues, many of whom are here. It's often my privilege to welcome people to our law school at these occasions, but we're not quite at our law school today. What I would say, and I know at least in the memory of at least one person who's here, this is in fact an old version of our law school. That for many years this was the reading room of the law library, inhabited by very different people than currently inhabit our law school, inhabited by, I think, taught by people who are very different from the people who currently teach at our law school, but also committed to the same excellence that I think we've seen tonight. What I would like to do is to do three things. First of all, to make some acknowledgements. Secondly, to talk a little bit about Fiona's lecture. And thirdly, to talk a little bit about Fiona and our experiences of her so far. First of all, I want to acknowledge the important people who are here. Her whānau, I know she's very grateful that you've made the journey, often the life-threatening journey in winter to Wellington, and they had some adventures, I understand, getting here. The price of living in Wellington, as a friend of mine once told, is landing at Rongotai. So you're honorary Wellingtonians, at least for tonight. I also want to acknowledge the people who aren't here from her whānau and the people that couldn't be here, and I think Fiona referred to them as well. We value your daughter very much, and we're thankful we have her now. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge Fiona's colleagues around the world, and when I say around the world, I really do mean around the world. She has colleagues in Canada, in the Maritimes, in Dalhousie. She has colleagues in Nepal. She has a very good colleague in Durham. What Fiona didn't tell you quite in her talk was that she is, for many of them, the central organising concept of the about somewhat disparate existences, that their networks are Fiona's networks and often created and curated by her. But I can attest that I've spoken to some of Fiona's colleagues, and they are, well, former colleagues. They were accepting that they were going to lose her, but also deeply regretful that they were going to lose her. And we thank and acknowledge their contribution to our law school and letting Fiona come to be with us. Well, I tried to explain to them that I didn't think it was because she didn't like them anymore. I said to them it was because we had the right accents. And the last group I want to acknowledge are my colleagues who are here tonight, because the law school is only colleagues. In particular, I want to acknowledge people that aren't actually here tonight who helped lead the committee that led to Fiona being hired. This was a somewhat unusual time in our law school. We had an acting dean who was very unsure of what he could do and what powers he had, and to make a professor seemed beyond those powers, whatever they were. And we probably wouldn't have been able to achieve this without the help of Professor Graham Austin, who led the committee, and Professor Susie Frank, who helped us in the considerations. And also, she's not here tonight either, Jane Bryson, the Dean of WSBG, who helped us. And also, I'm not sure whether Brian is here, who actually believed me when we said we should actually make a professor. So I acknowledge all of those people for helping us achieve the ultimate goal, which started a long time ago in 2019, to bring Fiona to our university. It was somewhat of a pity we didn't hire in 2019, because who would have thought we needed a public health lawyer in 2020? But hopefully we aren't about to have another pandemic to validate our decision. I just wanted to say a little bit about the lecture. As other deans are in these contexts, it's a bit odd to talk about something which is not actually your specialty. So what I thought I might just reflect on is what I tell the students. We've been doing recruiting around New Zealand, and what secondary school students want to know: why should you study law? And there's lots of reasons you should study law. It could make you rich, it could give you a fancy car, you could learn to think like a lawyer, but that begs the question of what it is to think like a lawyer. And what you saw tonight is the example which I always give to students of why I value so much being a lawyer and what I think lawyers bring to public policy that's not unique, but which is special. What lawyers bring, what we train our students to do, is to focus on particular facts or particular cases and to worry inordinately about the justice of a particular case. And that's what my colleagues do every day in front of our students and in front of the academic audiences around the world. We focus on facts because facts really do matter. And you heard today that facts really do matter. It's important to know that someone lived at Adams Terrace and survived. But also, that's not enough to be a good lawyer. And my colleagues also teach the other part of what Fiona has done so well tonight, which is to connect to the much broader story. That lawyers need to take the knowledge they gain of particular facts and particular justice of particular facts and apply them in this public policy context. But it's only if we do public policy without facts, we don't really have very good public policy. And one of the things in my life when I've done public policy, and Fiona exhibited so well tonight, is the importance of those facts in shaping the reality of the big visions. Because often big visions, and there are lots of isms, probably scary for the people that used to inhabit this room in Fiona's lectures, but the isms don't help us so much unless we understand the facts of the people in front of us. And that's why being a lawyer is a real gift, and why it's always enjoyed being able to say that I'm a lawyer, and Fiona showed so well. The last thing I wanted to express to Fiona in person is my gratitude for the fact that she has proven in this lecture, but more importantly through her conduct over the last 6 or so months, that we were absolutely right in doing something which has actually become reasonably extraordinary at our law school, to hire an outside professor. Some of you might not realise, might not attend inaugural lectures as much as some of the people in this room do. But this was a very unusual inaugural lecture because it actually was an inaugural lecture. This is actually the first time Fiona has given a lecture at this university, which is actually extraordinary. Normally it's like me, people like me who have been here forever, and some of my colleagues in a similar position. I'm also grateful to Fiona, and there are probably other people in this room equally grateful, that I am no longer the Associate Dean of Learning and Teaching, and that Fiona has taken this burden. Fiona also is a great professor because she actually cares greatly about learning and teaching, which is actually the other part of our core value. And it's great to see students here, and I hope that's the impression you have of what we try and do at our law school. But it's great to have Fiona's enthusiasm. So if I could return back to the people that used to inhabit this room, they would probably be a bit worried about some of the things that they have heard tonight. I suspect they wouldn't necessarily understand some of the words that we used, and they probably may not have appreciated perhaps being labelled as part of the problem. But we're all part of the problem, and one of the great things about universities is that we have great people like Fiona who come to join us to help us explore how we can do better in the future. So thank you for coming, Fiona. Thank you for the people in the room who helped hire Fiona, and thank you everybody else. Good night.